from the high desert. Want to take a ride? As I broached the subject of enlisting in the service, my parents probably breathed a big sigh of relief as they were beginning to run out of ideas on how to deal with the black sheep of the family, and since their marriage was on very thin ice at that point, they did not need additional problems from me. Accordingly, even though I was still only 17 at the time, they signed the necessary consent form, and I was officially enlisted in the Air Force and off to see the world. Now, when I was 17, I got out of high school. I enlisted in the armed services. This was in 1962, and the Vietnam fiasco was at its early stage. At any rate, at that time, I just decided more or less arbitrarily the Air Force sounded like a good part of the armed services to enter. I certainly didn't want to enlist in the Marines, like my parents had done earlier. I knew better. Of course, the first part of my experience with the Air Force was 8 weeks of excruciating basic training, commonly referred to as boot camp, or living hell. My boot camp training was at Lackland Air Force Base. Oh, God, it was awful. It was both physically and mentally demanding. They put you under tremendous pressure. They call you names. They degrade you in front of everybody. You work out physically like you cannot imagine. It was torture. It was hell. Their aim, of course, was to weed out the weak from those who would endure. The approach taken to weed people out is smart. They didn't want the weaklings, and they shouldn't have them. After all, you want the toughest people you can get to fight for our country. I remember each night when I returned to my bunk in the barracks, I wondered what I'd gotten myself into. I'd lie there and say, what the hell have I done? I wondered whether I lost my mind. It was as though when I was home, I was in the frying pan. Now, in the Air Force, I was in the fire. Nevertheless, I stayed throughout 8 miserable weeks of it. Then, after all that was done, they assigned me to become a medic. To become a medic, I was first sent to Greenville Air Force Base in Greenville, Mississippi. This was followed by Gunter Air Force Base in Alabama. Finally, I was sent to Amarillo Air Force Base in Texas. I stayed for a period of 18 months at the hospital at Amarillo Air Force Base there in Texas. Turned out to be a very, very eventful 18 months. Being trained as a medic and engaging in medicine, as I did in the armed forces, I must say, it was something I very much enjoyed. Of course, I was in constant close contact with doctors. I became familiar with them on a very personal basis. And military doctors, I discovered, have a very perverted sense of humor. As a matter of fact, this may well be true of all doctors. I don't know. At any rate, one day, an unnamed woman that I knew at the time found a lump under my left shoulder blade. Naturally, I panicked. So I went to the hospital to have one of my doctor friends take a look-see. He poked around and exclaimed, "Oh, yes, we have something here. And we're just going to have to do a little bit of outpatient-type surgery and pop this sucker out." Well, he went on to explain that it probably was nothing more than a fatty little tumor which could be easily dealt with. They decided, therefore, that it was not a major deal, and so there was no need to put me under general anesthetic. All they needed to do was inject a couple of shots of xylocaine, a local anesthetic to numb the area. So they took me into the operating room, where they had me lay down on my stomach to inject a couple of shots of xylocaine and get to work. Well, as they began to explore this thing they had discovered, they found out it was not exactly a little tumor, but something that extended deeply into my chest cavity. Unfortunately, once they had me opened up, they could not put me under general anesthetic to continue with the operation for some mysterious medical reason or another. Their only alternative was to pump in more xylocaine, and they did that. They injected 30 more shots of xylocaine into me, and believe it or not, I still felt them cutting and snipping in there. It was awful. By this time, several doctors were working on me, and this dragged on for several hours. Eventually, they clipped and snipped the damn tumor out of me. Well, I'll tell you, those were the days when they did not have the facilities to test the tumor right there. They had to send a sample off to a lab elsewhere to find out if the thing was benign or malignant. If the results revealed the tumor was malignant, that would mean I still had something to worry about. Anyway, they took out as much as they could and closed me up, and I had to sit and wait for the results. 'Twas about 4 days later, the doctor I knew called me into his office for the results. I came in, sat down, stared at the doctor, who looked at me with a very stern, concerned expression, and then he said, "Art, I don't know how to tell you this, and I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but you only have about 6 months." Well, when I heard this, I did what anybody else would do. My stomach turned inside out. My heart began to race. My face drained of all its color, and I broke into a cold sweat. At that moment, the doctor couldn't contain himself any longer, began cracking up, laughing his ass off. Here was a man, a captain of rank, and right in front of me, he fell on the floor, laughing, until I thought he'd split. Well, I guess this must have been about the funniest thing he ever done his whole life, he thought. I, on the other hand, couldn't share the mirth. I sat sullenly by, eventually clasping my head in my hands, and began to cry. It was about this time that this ass of a doctor picked himself up off the floor and realized that what he'd done was perhaps not so funny to me. The tumor they had actually taken out was an unusually large, fatty, benign tumor. I was okay. I must say, however, this was probably one of the scariest things in my life. The other interesting story about my experience at Amarillo Air Force Base is the occasion when I got involved in establishing a illegal radio station on the base. It was during my stint with the Armed Services that I inadvertently began my radio career. I was stationed at Amarillo Air Force Base at the time. One day I was bored, and I missed using my ham set, which had been my passion for many years, right up until I enlisted in the Air Force. Just for the hell of it, I began poking around the base to see what I could find. I eventually got a Heathkit variable frequency oscillator, an old Heathkit VFO. The Heathkit VFO was used essentially to drive a ham radio transmitter. With my knowledge and skill in electronics, I converted this VFO to operate on the AM radio band. Then, in my barracks room, I figured out a way to put music on the VFO, or modulate it, and managed to transmit to the barracks located around the base. Just for fun, I began transmitting music to the guys in the barracks. Most of them loved it. They tuned in their radios every night for quite some time and got music without commercial interruption. Eventually, our first sergeant found out about it, and he talked to the commanding officer. Well, the commanding officer decided that he did not want to have us have our own little radio station in the barracks. By this time, I'd met Lynn Whitlake, who became involved with my little enterprise, as well as Paul Gerard, another good friend. Lynn and Paul were very much involved, and the commanding officer called us in to confront us all about the radio station and said, "What are you guys up to?" Well, we said we thought it'd be okay to play music for the guys on the base, so we made a transmitter, a radio transmitter. I responded somewhat meekly. The commanding officer pondered all this for a moment, looked at the three of us, standing there at attention. "You know, guys," he said, "you really shouldn't be doing this in the barracks." He said somberly, "What I'm going to do is call the military amateur radio station commander at the base and see if they might be willing to give you a couple of rooms where you can do your broadcast." Well, naturally, upon hearing this, our little eyes lit up. We got all excited. This commander had no idea what he was doing, but he thought he was doing a good thing. I couldn't believe it. I thought we were about to get reprimanded, maybe end up cleaning toilets for the next week, and yet the commanding officer all but told us to begin our own station. He just wanted it out of the barracks. You know, that's the way it is in the military sometimes. Get it away from me. As long as I don't see it, it's okay. Anyway, we were all surprised and elated. We all said, "Yeah, let's do it." And so we did. Neither the commanding officer, nor anybody else for that matter, had any concept of commercial broadcasting, what was legal, what was not legal. They just wanted to get it handled. That's the military for you. So, with the commanding officer's blessings, we managed to build an entirely illegal pirate radio station at the Military Amateur Radio Service building. In hindsight, this was obviously meant to be for me. It was the beginning of my radio career, although it began outside the law with an illegal radio station. In the 2 rooms allocated to us, we built a complete studio equipped with records, turntables, a board to control everything, a microphone, noisemakers, all the other usual studio trappings. I decided first to get a higher-powered radio transmitter and convert this whole thing to the broadcast band. We also erected for ourselves a huge antenna, about 300 feet long. Then we went on the air. When we first went on the air, you couldn't only hear us at the barracks, but actually all over Amarillo Air Force Base. Well, we were a hit. Everybody loved our radio station, which we called Amarillo's KMED, or KMED for the Medical Squadron. We had a marvelous time. We had a great time. After a while, we discovered the transmitter and the antenna worked a little too well. We were also picked up about 30 miles away by the city of Amarillo. At that time, the city of Amarillo had about 150,000 people. As we were not only on daily, but on a 24-hour schedule, and we provided the popular music of the day without commercial interruption, it made it very difficult for the legitimate commercial stations to compete with us. But somehow we managed to stay on the air without any hindrance for a full year. To give you some idea of a little bit of what we did, I have gone back, thanks to Lynn Whitleg, and managed to resurrect a little bit of actually what aired all those years ago, 30 years ago, however long ago it was, at Amarillo Air Force Base. And if you listen very carefully, you'll get a taste of it. It was utter madness, but it was fun. And here's actually a little piece of what occurred 30 years ago. Listen to this. Unbelievable.
KMED. This is the Art Bell Show, swinging your way from now until 7 o'clock right here in Amarillo Air Force Base. This is a medical squadron. Amarillo Air Force Base is best, and don't you forget it. We'll be right here, as I said, till 7 o'clock, followed up by Lightning Lynn, and KMED is going to be swinging your way with the top 40 every night of every week of every year.
What do you think? Did I sound a little different then, folks? Unbelievable.
Remember, if you turn that dial on your radio, you are just plain wasting your cotton-picking electricity.
That was KMED. And every once in a while, in the world of radio, they conduct a survey. It's called an Arbitron survey. It determines how many people are listening to each radio station in a given geographic area. Well, the radio stations are then ranked for the market they cover. Unfortunately for us, KMED showed up on the Arbitron survey in Amarillo. Every commercial station in the city of Amarillo went berserk. Not only did they realize we existed suddenly, but they also realized we were probably robbing them of a significant number of their audience. After all, we were playing the same music, and we were just as fun to listen to, but we didn't run commercials. Naturally, they wanted to get rid of us. It wasn't hard. Complaints reached the commander of our base, and once again we found ourselves in his office standing at attention. This time he was not so supportive. In clear, strong terms, it was explained to us we had an illegal radio station. What we were doing was illegal, and KMED was history from that point forward. That was the end of it. Despite its short-lived history, KMED was significant to me because it was the beginning of my entry into the world of professional broadcasting. After my 18-month stint at Amarillo, I received orders. My dreams for travel would be fulfilled by the Air Force in a big way. I was to be transferred to Kadena Air Force Base on the island of Okinawa, Japan. Actually, we administered Okinawa at that time. Okinawa is southwest of mainland Japan, about 300 miles east of mainland China. From Texas, the Air Force was basically sending me to the other side of the world. Quite frankly, I could not have been happier. I was given 30 days leave to prepare. So I flew back home to Connecticut, packed my bags, said goodbye to my family, got on an airplane, and off I went to begin an adventure that probably shaped the rest of my life. I'll never forget it. When I got off the airplane at Kadena, I went through an amazing, intriguing, life-altering experience. I was young, excited, ready for adventure. It's amazing to think about how it affected me immediately as I entered this new world of the Orient. All my senses were stimulated. Every sight, smell, sound, sense that I'd realized, everything that I was accustomed to in America was different here in the Orient. This was not like traveling to Europe. This is altogether different. Right away I fell in love with the people, the culture, and I began to learn the language. On the base, I did my job as a medic at the hospital there. Every spare moment I had, any moment I could get off the base, I spent my time carousing, learning about the culture, and, yes, womanizing. That's when I developed my love for Oriental women. The experience was incredible to me, and I finally just figured a way to move off base altogether. I so wanted to assimilate completely with these people. Off base, I lived as a Japanese person, living with a Japanese girl in a Japanese home. Like the Japanese, I slept on the floor on what are called tatami mats, ate Japanese food, wore their clothes, watched Japanese television, and so on. It was as though I became Japanese. The Air Force, of course, was not completely thrilled about my cohabitating with one of the locals. They felt that I had a barracks room on base, and that's where I ought to be. Aha! So, to offset this, I hired an Okinawan to keep my barracks room clean. He'd come in and clean it, shine my shoes, put them in their proper place under my bed. Even though I was having a most enjoyable time on Okinawa, Vietnam was in full swing. Tragically, there were growing numbers of American casualties because of what was going on in Vietnam. At the outset of the flow of American casualties, the injured were flown from Saigon all the way to the U.S. for treatment non-stop. There were no appropriate medical facilities in Vietnam to treat the injured. Besides, it was probably too dangerous anyhow. But the American press learned of it, creating an instant stir, resulting in political pressure, which quickly stopped the flow of casualties to the U.S. Needing an alternative, it was decided the casualties would be flown to Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines. Consequently, in an effort to assist doctors dealing with the influx of casualties, there were several times during my time at Kadena Air Force Base that I was temporarily transferred to the hospital at Clark. What I saw at the hospital at Clark Air Base was horrible and tragic. I'll never forget it as long as I live. To this day, I've really actually got a lot of difficulty thinking about it, let alone talking about it. To constantly see people coming back with limbs missing, other part of their bodies destroyed, Making it impossible to live normally ever again was very, very difficult for me. But I did the best I could. Not long after my brief stint at Clark Air Base, I was temporarily transferred to Da Nang in Vietnam to help out with casualties there. Wasn't on the front lines, but I saw the result of those who were. Again, what I saw was horrible, and it is very difficult for me to think, talk, or write about. Finally, my 4 years with the Air Force were up. And even leading up to that day, I really struggled in my mind about what to do. I had difficulty in trying to decide whether or not I wanted to re-enlist in the Air Force and stay on for several more years. But I had really pretty much had my fill of the Air Force. The armed forces are simply too regimented and restricted for me. It was more in my nature to be free and unrestricted. This may seem strange, because my life now is very structured and disciplined. It must be. But the vast difference between the structure of the armed forces and my own is just that. It's my structure, my terms, so I don't mind. So I decided to get out of the Air Force. In 1966, I was discharged from the Air Force at March Air Force Base in California. I didn't regret leaving the Air Force, but I did regret leaving the Orient when I was in California. I missed it. Nonetheless, I resigned myself to my decision at the time and decided to take some time to get my bearings.
We go.